40 years ago, a woman in the Mississippi Delta vanished from her own kitchen, leaving behind a cast-iron skillet on a lit stove, a half-folded basket of laundry on the back porch, and a screen door that was found swinging open in the October wind. Authorities at the time ruled her death an accident, a fall down the cellar stairs in the dark, they said. A tragic domestic mishap in a farmhouse that had always had loose boards and poor light. Her family said something different from the very first day. They said Dorothy Mae Simmons was not a woman who fell. She was a woman who was taken. And for 40 years, no one in any official capacity listened to them. Then, in the autumn of 2023, a hospice nurse in a county 40 miles from where Dorothy Mae died picked up the phone and made a call that would end 4 decades of silence. Because the man dying in the bed in front of her had just told her something that she understood immediately could not go unheard. What he said would finally give Dorothy Mae's family what they had been asking for since 1983. And it would put a name to the kind of evil that hides not in shadows but in plain sight, at Sunday dinners, at family funerals, in the front pew of a church where everyone called him a good man. Dorothy Mae Simmons was 52 years old in October 1983. She had lived her entire life within 11 miles of the town of Belzoni, Mississippi, which sits in the middle of Humphreys County in the heart of the Delta, where the land is so flat that on a clear morning you can stand in a cotton field and see the curve of the horizon in every direction. She had been born in that county, gone to school in that county, married in that county, and raised 4 children in a white clapboard farmhouse on a gravel road 3 miles outside of town that her husband's family had owned since 1951. Her husband, Reverend Clarence Simmons, led the congregation at Mount Zion Baptist Church, not as its full-time minister, but as a deacon who had over 20 years become so central to the church's life that the distinction had blurred in the minds of most members. Dorothy Mae sang in the choir. She had sung in it for 31 years. She had a voice that the older members of the congregation described, even decades later, with a particularity that grief sometimes produces. They could tell you exactly where she stood, exactly how she held the hymnal, exactly which note she hit that made the back rows go quiet. She worked the mail route for Humphreys County for 18 years. 6 days a week in a government postal truck that she referred to by the last 2 digits of its license plate, Old 47, she drove 114 miles of rural roads, box to box, farm to farm. She knew the names of the dogs at every mailbox. She knew which families were behind on their bills by the weight of the envelopes that came back. She knew which elderly residents would not appear at their box for 2 days running without a reason, and when that happened, she stopped and knocked. On 3 separate occasions over her 18 years on the route, Dorothy Mae Simmons was the person who discovered that an elderly resident had suffered a medical event and needed help. She had called for an ambulance each time. One of those residents, a woman named Alva Jean Butts, who had lived alone since her husband died in 1974, had told Dorothy Mae's daughter afterward that Dorothy Mae had sat with her on the kitchen floor, holding her hand, until the ambulance arrived. "She talked to me about her garden," Alva Jean had said. "She talked to me about her tomatoes and her runner beans, and she didn't let go of my hand one time." She had 7 grandchildren by 1983, the oldest of whom was 9, and called her Nana Dot. The youngest had been born that June. She had held him at the hospital and brought a jar of her watermelon preserves for the new parents, because that was Dorothy Mae. She arrived places with something in her hands. On the morning of October 14, 1983, her husband Clarence left for a deacon's meeting in Greenwood at 7:30. He kissed her goodbye at the kitchen door. She was frying fatback for breakfast and had the radio on, Wessie out of Greenville, the station she always kept on low in the mornings. She waved him off with the spatula. The screen door swung shut behind her. That was the last time Clarence Simmons saw his wife alive. When he returned from Greenwood at 4:30 that afternoon, he found the fatback burned to carbon in the skillet, the stove still lit, the laundry basket half emptied on the back porch, and the screen door open to the October air. Dorothy May was at the bottom of the cellar stairs. She had been there, the coroner would estimate, for several hours. The Humphreys County Sheriff's Department arrived at the farmhouse at 5:07 in the afternoon. The responding deputy, a man named Tolliver, who had been on the force for 3 years, assessed the scene as a domestic accident. The cellar staircase was steep and made of pine boards that had warped over the years. The light at the top of the stairs was a bare 60-watt bulb on a pull cord. The deputy noted that the pull cord was not extended. The light was off. He concluded that Dorothy May had attempted to descend the stairs in poor light and fallen. The county coroner, reached by telephone that evening, concurred without visiting the scene. The death certificate was signed the following day. Cause of death: accidental fall. The file was closed. The family disputed this within 48 hours. Dorothy May's eldest daughter, Bernice, told the sheriff directly that her mother did not go to the cellar alone. She had a rule about it, a rule so consistent that her children could all name it without prompting. Dorothy May was afraid of the dark in enclosed spaces, a fear that dated from a childhood accident in a storm shelter, and she had never descended those cellar stairs without calling someone to pull the cord first. She always asked. She had asked for 25 years. She would not have gone down in the dark. Bernice said this to the sheriff. She said it to the county coroner. She said it to a state representative's office. She was told, on each occasion, in different formulations of the same basic dismissal, that grief can make us believe things we need to believe, and that the evidence did not support anything other than an accidental fall. What the deputy's report had not recorded, and what would not be raised officially for 40 years, was a detail that Clarence Simmons mentioned to his pastor the following week, and that his pastor mentioned at the funeral, and that Bernice would carry with her for the rest of her life. The cellar door, the exterior cellar door on the north side of the farmhouse, the one that could be accessed from the yard, which was padlocked from the outside, and had been padlocked since the summer, was unlatched when the deputy arrived. Clarence had mentioned it because he thought it was strange. The deputy had not written it down. There was one person who had been at the farmhouse that morning. A man named Harlan Pruitt, Dorothy May's brother-in-law, married to Clarence's younger sister Ida, had stopped by at approximately 9 o'clock that morning, ostensibly to return a canning jar he had borrowed in September. Bernice remembered this because Dorothy May had mentioned it the week before, had said, with a flatness in her voice that Bernice had not pressed on at the time, that Harlan was coming by, and she wished he wouldn't. Harlan Pruitt told deputies he had stayed for no more than 15 minutes, had a cup of coffee, left Dorothy May washing up the breakfast dishes. Nothing wrong, nothing unusual. The deputy wrote this down. He wrote it down and did not follow up. Harlan Pruitt attended Dorothy May's funeral. He sat 3 rows back. He helped carry the casket to the graveside. Bernice watched him do it and felt something that she could not put into words for 40 years, because she did not have enough to make it a fact. And in Humphreys County, Mississippi, in 1983, a black woman's feelings about a white man who had been her family by marriage for 16 years were not going to open a closed case. The years did what years do to the wronged. They kept moving. Clarence Simmons led his congregation at Mount Zion for another 11 years before his own health failed, and he died in 1994 without ever believing his wife had fallen. Bernice raised her own children and then helped raise her siblings' children, and kept a small framed photograph of Dorothy May on the wall above the kitchen table, and told every grandchild who asked about it exactly who she was, and what had happened, and why the family had never stopped saying she was taken. "You say it," she told them, "until somebody listens." Harlan Pruitt and his wife Ida divorced in 1987. He remarried in 1989, moved to Atala County, 40 miles northeast, and became, by every account gathered later, the same man in the new county that he had appeared to be in the old one. He attended church. He worked a small equipment repair business out of a shed behind his house. He was known among his neighbors in Atala County as quiet, reliable, church-going, a good man. He had no criminal record. He had never been charged with anything. He was, in the new county, simply a man who had arrived in 1989 and who had been there ever since, growing old without incident, which is what most men do, and which is what makes the ones who are hiding something so difficult to distinguish from everyone else. The house in Belzoni sat empty for a decade before Clarence's estate sold it. The Mount Zion congregation planted a dogwood tree in the churchyard in Dorothy May's memory and held a small ceremony for the 30th anniversary of her death in 2013. Bernice attended. She was 72 years old. She drove herself. She said the same thing she had been saying for 30 years. Dorothy May did not fall. And the congregation believed her. Because they had always believed her. And because belief without power to act is its own particular grief. Every case on this channel is built from the real records of real lives, the case files, the court documents, the interviews, the details that were written down, and the ones that were not. If you want us to keep telling stories like Dorothy May's, stories that took too long and cost too much, but finally arrived at the truth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. These stories reach people in places we never expected, and every single person watching is part of why this work continues. Now, back to Belzoni, and to what finally happened. In September 2023, Harlan Pruitt was 81 years old and dying of end-stage pancreatic cancer in a hospice facility in Atala County. He had been a patient for 6 weeks. His attending nurse, a woman named Tamara Eccles, who had worked in hospice care for 14 years, had seen many things in that time, had been present at deaths that were peaceful and deaths that were not, had heard things in the rooms of the dying that she understood belonged to the particular truth telling that proximity to death sometimes produces. What she heard from Harlan Pruitt on the night of September 19, 2023, was different from anything she had heard before. She was adjusting his medication line at approximately 11 o'clock when he spoke without prompting. She would later describe him as lucid, not confused, not medicated into incoherence, but present and deliberate in a way that she found, in retrospect, almost rehearsed. He said that he had done something he needed to say out loud before he died. He said a woman's name. He said what he had done to her. He said where. He said that he had never told anyone and that he wanted someone to know before he was gone. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for anything. He stated it, and then he turned his face toward the window. Tamara Eccles is a mandatory reporter. She understood this immediately. She documented what she had heard in clinical notes with the precision that her training required. And at 7 the following morning, she called the Atala County Sheriff's Office. The call was transferred to a detective named Barry Odom, who had been with the department for 9 years. Odom listened. He took down the name, Dorothy May Simmons, Belzoni, Humphreys County, 1983. He ran it. He found the file, closed, cause of death accidental. 40 years old, 4 pages. He read those 4 pages twice. He called Humphreys County. And then, because Atala County had no jurisdiction over a death that occurred in Humphreys County 4 decades earlier, he made a second call to the Mississippi Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, which had been established in 2019 specifically to handle cases where the originating jurisdiction lacked resources or standing to reopen independently. The AG's investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Darla Hutchins. She drove to Belzoni on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, exactly 40 years, and 1 week after Dorothy Mae Simmons was found at the bottom of her cellar stairs. She knocked on Bernice's door. Bernice was 82 years old. She came to the door with a dish towel in her hand. Darla Hutchins introduced herself and said the state had reopened her mother's case. Bernice looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Come in." She said, "I've been waiting for someone to come to this door for 40 years. She did not cry. She sat down at her kitchen table, below the framed photograph on the wall, and she began to talk. What Darla Hutchins built over the following 3 months was the case that the 1983 investigation had failed to construct. She located 3 witnesses who had never been formally interviewed. A farmhand who had been working a field adjacent to the Simmons property on the morning of October 14th, and who had seen Harlan Pruitt's truck parked on the grass beside the north face of the house, beside the exterior cellar door, at a time that did not match Pruitt's own account of when he had arrived and left. She located the original coroner's handwritten notes, which had been archived but never typed into the county system, and which contained a notation, flagged and then apparently set aside, that the bruising pattern on Dorothy Mae's arms was inconsistent with a fall and more consistent with restraint. She located the deputy's original scratch notes, separate from his filed report, which included a line about the exterior cellar door that had never made it into the formal document. She drove to the hospice facility and interviewed Harlan Pruitt on October 31st, 2023. He was weaker than he had been in September. His attorney was present. He exercised his right not to answer most questions. But when Hutchins placed a photograph of Dorothy Mae on the table between them, the photograph from the Mount Zion Church Directory, Dorothy Mae in her choir robe smiling, Harlan Pruitt looked at it and looked away, and his attorney immediately said they were done for the day. Darla Hutchins noted his reaction in her report. She noted the specific nature of it. A man who had nothing to do with a death does not look away from a photograph of the woman who died. Harlan Pruitt was charged with murder in the first degree on November 18, 2023. He was served the charging documents in his hospice bed. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. He died 11 days later, on November 29, 2023, before any trial proceedings could begin. The state formally closed the case as a solved homicide, with Harlan Pruitt named as the perpetrator of record. The news arrived in Belzoni the way all news had always arrived there. Through the church network before the newspaper, through the families before the institutions. When Bernice's phone rang that November morning, it was her youngest sister calling, and the youngest sister was crying, and Bernice sat at her kitchen table and listened, and when she hung up, she stayed in her chair for a while. Then she got up and walked to the kitchen window and stood there, looking out at the gravel road, at the flat delta light, at the nothing that had held this secret for 40 years. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She felt something quieter than that. Something that was not peace exactly, but was the first moment in 40 years that was not the absence of it. Dorothy Mae Simmons was 52 years old. She fried fatback in a cast-iron skillet and kept the radio on low in the mornings. She sat on the kitchen floor with a sick woman and talked about tomatoes until the ambulance arrived. She drove 114 miles of Delta roads 6 days a week and knew the name of every dog at every mailbox. She had a voice the back rows remembered, and 7 grandchildren who called her Nana Dot, and a jar of watermelon preserves she brought to every new mother she knew, and a rule about the cellar stairs that her children could recite without prompting. She had a husband who never believed she fell. She had a daughter who said her name out loud for 40 years, until someone finally came to the door. Harlan Pruitt carried what he did for 40 years. He carried it to a new county, and a new wife, and a church pew where people called him a good man. He carried it through the funerals of every person who had known Dorothy May, and through the years that buried the case and let the file grow thin. He carried it to a hospice bed where the weight of it became, at the very end, too much to carry alone. He chose to put it down quietly, at 11 o'clock at night, into the ear of a nurse who understood exactly what she was required to do with it. 40 years is a long time for a family to wait. It is not long enough for a man like that to think he had gotten away. There are questions this case demands. Bernice Simmons spent 40 years saying her mother did not fall, and was dismissed every time. At what point does a family's consistent, detailed, credible account of a suspicious death require a formal response, and who is responsible when it doesn't receive one? The detail about the exterior cellar door was in the deputy's scratch notes and never made it to the official report. How many closed cases from that era contain undocumented details that were noticed and then lost? And finally, Harlan Pruitt chose to confess to a hospice nurse rather than to his family, his church, or the investigators who came to his door. What does it mean that the only accountability he accepted came 11 days before he died, when the cost of it was 0? Dorothy Mae Simmons waited 40 years. The truth did not let him go quietly. If you believe that no case should stay closed while a family is still asking questions, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More solved cold cases are in the description below. Thank you for watching.